Arthur's tranquil farm becomes a battleground and a neighboring upscale community decides to expand. A series of nagging HOA letters escalates, demanding the removal of unwanted livestock and outbuildings. A fierce boundary dispute erupts, yet the HOA presses on, convinced of its authority. While Arthur is away tending to a sick relative, his farm mysteriously goes up in flames overnight. The fire claims his livestock and destroys everything he has built over the years. Collected evidence points to arson, while the HOA scrambles to dodge blame. A series of depositions and behind-the-scenes confessions reveal the hidden motives of powerful HOA members. Neighbors split into two camps, some condemn the wrongdoing, others fear speaking out. Arthur gathers evidence, attorneys, and allies to rebuild his farm and hold those responsible accountable. Stay tuned if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more exciting stories ahead. Arthur Caldwell had always prided himself on living off the land. His small property, tucked away at the edge of Greenhaven County, bore fruit trees, vegetable patches, and a modest barn where he kept hens, a couple of goats, and the occasional rescued stray cat. For more than a decade, the farm had been his sanctuary. He had grown accustomed to the early morning calls of roosters, the rustling of hay under goat hooves, and the rows of tomatoes that would eventually find their way into mason jars. There was a sense of harmony around every corner of his property, a feeling that came from knowing nothing stood between him and a simple, self-sufficient life. The trouble began gradually. A few years earlier, upscale subdivisions started sprawling across the neighboring fields. They appeared with fresh asphalt roads, ornate street lamps, and proudly displayed signs announcing luxurious new homes for affluent buyers. While Arthur did not initially resent the expansion, he could not help noticing the changes it brought. Strangers now walked along the rural paths, eyeing his goats with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Realtors rolled through in sleek vehicles, pointing at the unpaved driveway that cut across Arthur's land, their expressions unreadable. Despite the slow creep of modern development, Arthur maintained a friendly demeanor toward newcomers. He once offered homemade goat cheese to passers-by who asked about his farm, though many politely declined, seemingly wary of food that did not come wrapped in plastic from a store. Over time, he began to sense the gap between the old country life he cherished and the polished ideals of the new residents. His barn and chicken coop, which he saw as symbols of honest work, might have looked like unsightly relics to those accustomed to neatly trimmed lawns and meticulously designed gardens. The first letter from a local homeowners association arrived unexpectedly. Arthur remembered how it had been slipped under his windshield wiper while he was parked at the only grocery store in town. He had never signed any papers tying him to any association, so the note's official tone and demands took him aback. The letter stated that a newly formed group, the Oakstone Meadows HOA, was overseeing community standards for an area that, it claimed, included his small parcel of farmland. The correspondence cited noise concerns, possible zoning infractions, and an invitation for him to comply with certain aesthetic guidelines. The tone was cordial but firm, leaving Arthur uncertain whether this was simply a mistake or an actual threat to his way of life. In the following weeks, Arthur made phone calls to clarify his legal boundaries. He reached out to the county clerk's office to confirm that his farmland predated the newly zoned developments. An official on the phone assured him that, as far as public records indicated, his property fell outside the HOA's established lines. Arthur, relieved, tucked the note away and resolved not to worry further. Days later, more letters appeared. Some were delivered by mail, others ended up in his mailbox with no postage, suggesting that someone had dropped them off personally. Each letter became more insistent. One pointed out the odor of barnyard animals drifting into the nearby high-end subdivision. Another mentioned that his row of tomato plants clashed with the new community guidelines for landscaping. To Arthur, the complaints seemed absurd. Chickens smelled like chickens, goats occasionally made noise, and tomatoes were hardly an eyesore. He soon realized there was a single name attached to each of these notices: Isabel Carter. She had recently taken the role of acting president for the Oakstone Meadows HOA. She had moved in months before to one of the freshly built luxury houses, complete with high hedges and modern architecture. Arthur had only seen her once in passing, a tall figure with immaculate hair, wearing expensive exercise attire as she jogged along the road bordering his field. She had not acknowledged him that morning. The tension escalated when Arthur discovered freshly installed signposts along the boundary of his property. The posts bore Oakstone Meadows branding and listed rules and regulations referencing homeowner obligations. He remembered the perplexed feeling that rose in his chest, wondering how anyone had decided to stake signs in his soil without even talking to him. The messages included warnings about unapproved structures, potential fines for violating noise restrictions, and the necessity for certain architectural harmony. The language left no doubt that Isabel Carter and the HOA were laying claim to oversight. Arthur felt the first sparks of indignation, yet he tried to keep a level head. He reasoned that misunderstandings happen. Perhaps the county's mapping system was temporarily out of date, or the HOA believed it had jurisdiction based on some incomplete record. He sought a straightforward, neighborly conversation, even leaving a polite note with the HOA's administrative office in town. For weeks, he received no response. When the next certified envelope arrived, Arthur recognized that this was not merely a polite request. The letter informed him of an impending penalty for failing to remove livestock structures that allegedly did not comply with new community standards. It cited the presence of goats and chickens as a breach of local noise and sanitation bylaws. With growing unease, Arthur noted the significantly larger fines, spelled out in bold type. The envelope included meticulously taken photographs of his barn, the goats grazing behind a sagging wire fence, and the hens pecking around the yard. The following morning, he found that one of the new signposts along the boundary had been knocked down. Though the cause could have been a passing truck or a curious goat, Arthur felt an unsettling vibe. He imagined Isabel Carter and others from the HOA patrolling the perimeter, photographing anything they deemed an infraction. The privacy he once took for granted seemed to be slowly peeling away. During this time, Arthur's elderly father, who lived 2 counties over, fell ill. Faced with an urgent phone call, Arthur packed a suitcase and arranged for a neighbor from the old days, a friendly retiree named Dennis, to check in on his animals. Since Dennis knew how to feed the goats and gather eggs from the hens, Arthur departed with some reassurance, though an uneasy feeling lingered about leaving the farm unguarded. He had installed a couple of cameras near his barn months ago after reading about petty thefts in the area, but they were basic models. The situation at his father's house demanded Arthur's attention for nearly 3 weeks. Between hospital visits and managing doctor's appointments, he had little time to think of the mounting letters from the HOA. His father's recovery was slow but steady, and as soon as Arthur felt comfortable leaving, he loaded up his old pickup truck and drove back toward Greenhaven County. He arrived home late in the afternoon under a dim sky. The moment he turned onto the dirt road leading to his property, he sensed something was wrong. Thin plumes of smoke still drifted across what used to be the outline of his barn. The structure that once housed his goats was reduced to blackened timbers, crumbling ash, and twisted metal. The remains of the chicken coop were scattered across scorched ground. A nauseating smell of burnt wood and singed grass hung in the air. He could tell immediately that it was not a small accident. The large black patch extended far beyond where the barn had stood, stretching into the spot where he grew tomatoes and squash. The fences he had painstakingly maintained for years were nearly gone, charred posts jutting up like skeletal remnants in a grim scene. He noticed the distinct silence, no clucking chickens, no bleating goats. Everything was heartbreakingly still. Arthur's mind whirled with speculation. He had no official documentation that any of this was planned, yet the extent of the damage suggested a deliberate act. He recalled the accelerating threats from the HOA and the notices that demanded he remove his animals. Could they have employed contractors to enforce their will? He wondered if a demolition crew had misunderstood an order. But the blackened debris and the smell of burnt plastic told him it was a fire, not a carefully executed removal. It did not look like a professional job either, it appeared savage, final, leaving no shred of his old life intact. An SUV approached from the main road and stopped at the edge of his property. A man wearing an official-looking lanyard stepped out, accompanied by a woman Arthur recognized as living in one of the newly built houses up the road. They offered clipped explanations, though Arthur could piece together only the gist of what they conveyed from their apologetic expressions and abrupt gestures. The man appeared to be a representative from a contracting company, while the woman wore a sympathetic yet apprehensive look. She indicated that the HOA had authorized some form of cleanup, claiming that the property was part of the Oakstone Meadows domain and thus subject to their codes. However, the fire itself was not part of their work order. As twilight fell, Arthur walked around the charred remains, searching desperately for any signs that his goats or chickens had survived. He found nothing but scorched earth. In place of the vibrant, homely chaos he once cherished, there was only destruction and the faint warmth still emanating from smoldering beams. He tried to recall if he had insured the barn comprehensively. His finances were always tight, and although he had home insurance, he suspected it might not cover outbuildings or livestock. Later that night, he rummaged through his small office in the main house, which miraculously stood untouched by the flames. Even a cursory glance at the camera footage revealed a partial story: silhouettes of strangers moving around the barn, the glint of a vehicle's headlights, then bright flashes and thick smoke. The camera was too outdated to capture clear faces or license plates, and it cut off shortly after the fire began. He sank into a chair, replaying the footage, growing more convinced that this was not simply an unfortunate accident. He recalled the mounting pressure from Isabel Carter, the continuous harassment via letters and fines, and the brazen manner in which signs had been posted on his land. He could not escape the feeling that all those official-sounding notices had built momentum toward this disastrous moment. Before dawn, he discovered a triangular boundary marker, half hidden near the farthest edge of his property. It was a small, rusting metal stake with faint, faded numbers, indicating the original county survey lines. He had seen it years before and paid it little mind, but now it felt like a vital clue in a puzzle that pitted an unwelcome homeowners association against the rightful borders of his farmland. The marker's presence reignited the same question he had asked the clerk's office: could it be that his farm was never under the HOA's jurisdiction at all? If that were true, everything that happened might be not just unethical, but entirely illegal. He wanted answers, but he also felt anger and despair clouding his thoughts. The place he loved was reduced to a smoldering ruin, and any official claims by the HOA only served as an insult to the injury he was experiencing. If the farmland truly lay outside the boundaries they controlled, then every letter, every threat, and this catastrophic act of destruction would be part of a colossal wrongdoing. Throughout the night, Arthur paced the yard, stepping carefully around scorched areas. The sky was overcast, amplifying the sense of gloom that settled over his property. Although he was physically exhausted from the drive and emotionally spent by the shock, he could not bring himself to rest. Each time he closed his eyes, he envisioned the gentle goat faces, the pecking hens, and the calm routine of his farm life. Everything he worked for was either lost or significantly damaged. At dawn, his phone buzzed incessantly. Many notifications came from neighbors and acquaintances, some who had heard rumors of the fire. A few offered condolences, while others asked if he needed immediate help with debris removal. Arthur responded to none of them, too overwhelmed to detail the chaos. What had once been a peaceful piece of land was now the epicenter of a painful dispute. Determined to verify the farm's legal status, he set out that morning for the county records office. In one sense, he did not expect an immediate resolution, yet he yearned for clarity. Deep down, he suspected the existence of a boundary line that might invalidate the entire claim of the HOA. If the farmland fell outside their domain, then the extent of their interference could be viewed as criminal. While driving, he recalled the many times he had considered negotiating in good faith with the HOA's leadership. He had considered small compromises, such as noise reduction measures or slightly altering the barn's appearance. He even wondered if building a taller fence or installing odor control systems could have satisfied their demands. Now, it was too late for such compromises. The land was scorched, the animals were gone, and the very notion of a peaceful resolution seemed unattainable. As he arrived at the records office, he felt a pang of anxiety. If his suspicion was wrong, if the association truly held jurisdiction over his land, then the entire fiasco might turn in their favor. Insurance claims could be denied, or the blame might shift to him for ignoring HOA directives. With a tight chest, he stepped inside the building, seeking an official who could confirm the county's surveying lines. While waiting, he took a seat in a stark corridor lit by fluorescent lights. He mentally ran through a list of next steps: contacting a lawyer, meeting with the local fire department to confirm the cause of the blaze, and searching for any witnesses who might have seen suspicious activity near his property. He wondered how many of his neighbors would be willing to speak up if the HOA was indeed responsible. Some of them might be reluctant to get involved. Others might be as outraged as he was, though they lacked the direct personal losses he had just suffered. Despite the emotional weight pressing down on him, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. The boundary marker he had found would surely match the official maps. If it did, he could prove that Oakstone Meadows had overstepped its bounds entirely. The path to justice would still be steep and complicated, but at least he would have the truth on his side. As he awaited the clerk's final confirmation, he thought back to the day he first saw that letter stuck under his windshield wiper. At the time, it had seemed like a trivial inconvenience, a minor administrative error. Now, in retrospect, it felt like the first warning shot in a conflict that had escalated beyond his darkest imagination. The tranquil life he had built was gone, replaced by the black ash on the ground and an unrelenting sense of betrayal. Soon, a county official appeared and motioned for Arthur to follow. They stepped into a small room lined with filing cabinets, the shelves sagging under the weight of bound ledgers and thick folders. The official pulled out a series of documents, old county surveys, property lines, and historical references. Arthur noted the official's expression shifting as they scanned each page, seemingly verifying that the farmland was indeed labeled separately, outside the Oakstone Meadows territory. The official's thoughtful nod appeared to confirm Arthur's suspicion. With that silent affirmation, Arthur felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief that he was right, fury that the HOA had managed to push him so far, and a deep sadness knowing that correctness would not resurrect his goats or rebuild the barn that had been part of his life for a decade. This was not the end of his ordeal, but the beginning of what would likely be a long battle to seek accountability. Leaving the records office with copies of key documents tucked under his arm, he returned to his truck. The day was growing warmer, and the bright sun felt incongruous to his somber mood. He knew the next step involved the local sheriff's department, fire investigators, and likely a legal confrontation with the HOA. He also suspected that Isabel Carter would not show any remorse, especially if she realized her attempts to absorb his farmland had skirted or violated the law. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, remembering the look of his land still smoldering in the early morning light. No matter how daunting the task, he would not let the destruction go unanswered. He had the boundary marker, the official records, and the remnants of camera footage that might identify the intruders on his property. The evidence, though partial, pointed to a wrong that demanded reparation. He drove back to the ruins of his farm, determined to start the process of sifting through debris for any salvageable keepsakes or materials. He intended to document every angle of the wreckage, aware that legal procedures would require photographs and thorough records of his losses. Darkness, both literal and metaphorical, had fallen over his life, yet he sensed a quiet resolve growing within him. He refused to accept that this was how his story would end. As evening descended once again, Arthur stood on the edge of his scorched field, focusing on the silent horizon where the new suburban homes sparkled with electric lights. He wondered which ones housed the individuals who signed off on the demands and threats. He wondered if any of them had the courage to speak out against the injustice he had suffered. Most of all, he wondered about Isabel Carter, the driving force behind Oakstone Meadows. If she had orchestrated even part of this destruction, then the battle that lay ahead would reach deeper than property lines and HOA regulations. It would be about righting a profound, calculated wrong, one that had cost him every outward marker of the life he loved. Though his heart ached, he resolved to fight. He would find a way to rebuild, to expose each actor involved, and to ensure that no one would endure a similar nightmare. The farmland, ruined as it was, remained his. He would carry that truth forward into whatever conflicts awaited, trusting that the law would ultimately recognize his rightful claim and provide him with a chance to restore what had been stolen from him. He lingered there as the last traces of daylight disappeared, the dim silhouettes of high-end houses merging with the starless sky. Tomorrow, he would begin the long process of confronting the HOA, gathering evidence, and seeking justice for the fire that consumed his barns and his livestock. For the moment, all he could do was stand vigil, alone with the smoldering remains of a life that could never be the same again. Arthur awoke the next day with a fierce clarity of purpose. The wreckage still loomed outside his window, an inescapable reminder that he had inherited a battleground rather than a simple homestead. Though his eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, he forced himself to start cataloging the damage in the early light. He moved systematically, taking photographs on his phone of every scorched support beam, every blackened panel of metal roofing, and each piece of debris scattered across the once thriving garden. The goat's pen, little more than charred posts and tangled wire, struck him with particular force. He paused, letting the moment linger in the silence, before snapping the last few pictures. He placed a call to the local sheriff's department, requesting an immediate investigation into what he believed to be arson. An official-sounding receptionist took his statement. Her voice calm and methodical despite his rising frustration. She informed him that a deputy would be out to assess the scene later in the day. Knowing there was little more to do until the deputy arrived, Arthur carried on with his self-assigned tasks, weaving in and out of soot-covered rubble as he gathered any vestige of his past life that might be salvaged. His next call was to the county's fire marshal, whose office was responsible for investigating suspicious fires. Though he had reached an automated service, he left a detailed message. In the background, the wind blew over the open fields, carrying with it a faint acrid smell of burnt chemicals. Arthur's mind kept returning to the notion that whoever set this blaze had to know how quickly a fire would consume the barn's dry wooden beams. It was almost certainly deliberate. A random spark or lightning strike could not have so thoroughly destroyed multiple structures with such precision. By midday, a weathered police cruiser pulled onto his property, tires crunching over loose gravel and ash. Deputy William Case, a broad-shouldered man with a thoughtful gaze, stepped out. He greeted Arthur politely, handing him a business card with the sheriff's department insignia. Arthur led him around the remains, explaining each structure's purpose, carefully detailing how the barn had been used for his goats and how the smaller coop had housed his chickens. The deputy jotted notes in a small spiral pad, nodding now and then but offering no immediate conclusions. Arthur recalled the sequence of threatening letters and the pointed involvement of the Oakstone Meadows HOA. The deputy listened with a measured expression, acknowledging that civil disputes could sometimes lead to criminal acts. Although he did not outright accuse the HOA of wrongdoing, the deputy made it clear that a thorough investigation would consider all angles, including conflicts over property lines. When the deputy mentioned the possibility that a contractor might have been acting under the HOA's orders, Arthur provided a flash drive containing the raw footage from his barn camera. He explained that the resolution was poor, but there might be a few frames capturing the silhouettes of vehicles entering his land just prior to the fire. The deputy took the drive, promising to have a technician examine it. After the deputy departed, Arthur headed inside and tried to distract himself by cleaning up his kitchen, which felt surreal given the devastation outside. The mundane act of wiping counters and checking for expired food in the fridge offered a brief reprieve from the emotional toll of the ruin that lay just beyond the windows. Still, each time he glanced outside, he could see only twisted metal and burned wood, a constant reminder of the uncertain future he now faced. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from a number he did not recognize. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Russell Kane, a local fire investigator. He informed Arthur that he would be arriving at the farm the next morning to perform an official assessment of the site, collect samples of debris, and conduct interviews as needed. Arthur felt a small measure of relief. At least steps were being taken to uncover the truth. In the brief lull that followed, Arthur decided to drive around the surrounding neighborhoods, hoping to find any eyewitnesses. He steered his old pickup truck down the roads that branched out from his property, pausing near the glimmering new subdivision that bore the Oakstone Meadows sign. The entryway was immaculate, flower beds bursting with color, a manicured lawn that led to an elegant stone gate, and a series of large homes that seemed to defy the rural backdrop. One by one, he cruised past the houses, glancing at the tidy driveways and curated front porches in search of anyone who might have noticed unusual activity on the night of the fire. He hesitated to knock on random doors. The tension between him and the HOA was palpable, and he did not want to risk confrontation without cause. Still, a few pedestrians walked the sidewalks, residents with dogs, parents pushing strollers, and a jogger or two. Arthur pulled over, rolling down his window to greet a middle-aged man who was walking a small terrier. The man looked wary when Arthur asked if he had seen anything strange near Arthur's farm in recent days. He shook his head, apologized, and quickly continued on his way. Arthur tried the same approach with two more individuals, receiving polite but dismissive answers. As evening fell, he felt more alone than ever. The bright lights of Oakstone Meadows illuminated rows of identical facades, but not a single person seemed interested in his problem. He turned the truck around and headed home. Perhaps tomorrow, with the fire investigator present, more official pressure could be applied to glean information. The next morning, Arthur woke to find an official-looking SUV idling at the edge of his property. Russell Kane, wearing a plain suit and carrying a metallic toolbox, introduced himself politely. He moved about the site, photographing angles of the charred barn and the scorched earth. Periodically, he knelt down, scooping small samples of soil or collecting bits of residue in plastic evidence bags. Arthur hovered nearby, answering questions about the day he left to care for his father and the details of how he found the property upon returning. Russell never made direct accusations, but he did confirm that it looked like an accelerant might have been used. He pointed out areas of burn patterns that implied the fire spread suspiciously fast. Arthur sensed a steely efficiency in the investigator's demeanor, as if he had dealt with similar cases of malicious property damage. Though Russell's guarded tone gave nothing away, Arthur felt a faint spark of validation. If the blaze was indeed arson, the next question was who had orchestrated it. After taking copious notes, Russell mentioned that he would analyze his findings and likely coordinate with law enforcement for follow-up interviews. As the investigator walked back to his vehicle, Arthur felt the weight of the investigation pressing in on him. Even a confirmed case of arson would not automatically identify the culprit. The web of the HOA's influence, possible contractors, and any uncooperative witnesses would make the process complicated. That afternoon, Arthur decided to reach out to a local attorney, Marcus Dean, who specialized in property disputes. He had found the name while combing through online reviews of small-town lawyers. Though short on funds, Arthur saw no other recourse. If the HOA was brazen enough to claim jurisdiction over his farm and then, whether directly or indirectly, destroy his barn, he needed legal guidance. Over the phone, Marcus sounded cautious but sympathetic. They arranged an appointment for the following week to discuss potential lawsuits, insurance claims, and any criminal charges that might be relevant. In the days leading up to the meeting, Arthur revisited the county clerk's office to request additional property records. He wanted every scrap of documentation that might clarify or confirm that Oakstone Meadows had no legal hold on his land. He also hoped to find historical records, anything that would definitively prove his family's ownership dating back decades, well before any suburban expansion. The staff at the records office, though polite, worked slowly, and Arthur left with only a portion of what he needed. Returning to the farm, he found a letter taped to his front door. The sleek envelope bore the Oakstone Meadows HOA logo, the same design he had come to dread. He peeled it off carefully, opening it with a sense of foreboding. Inside was a typed message that reiterated community concerns over the state of disrepair at his property, indicating that failing to address the remnants of the burned structures constituted an eyesore. The letter also mentioned the possibility of fines unless he complied with certain beautification measures. To Arthur, the letter was more than a mere inconvenience, it was an affront. They had the gall to point fingers at him for the damage they had most likely caused. He stood on his porch, seething with indignation, wondering just how far they intended to push him. Though fueled by anger, Arthur set aside the letter and carried it indoors. He scanned it into a digital file, placing it alongside the growing collection of evidence he was amassing. Whatever the final outcome, he wanted to be armed with every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Each threat, each piece of misdirected blame, formed another link in the chain that he believed would ultimately tie the HOA to his farm's destruction. A few days later, he drove into town for his appointment with Marcus Dean. The law office was on the second floor of a refurbished Victorian home, a stark contrast to the modern design of the newly built county offices. Inside, the decor was warm, with wooden floors and large windows letting in plenty of natural light. Marcus Dean was a slender man, a little older than Arthur, with neatly combed gray hair and a calm, attentive bearing. They settled into seats at a large oak desk, where Arthur laid out the property records, the letters from Oakstone Meadows, and the photographs of his fire-ravaged land. Marcus spent several minutes reviewing each document, occasionally asking Arthur pointed questions about the sequence of events. He seemed especially interested in the fact that Arthur's farm sat outside the official HOA boundary lines. Arthur took careful note of Marcus's raised eyebrows and the soft whistle he let out upon reading some of the more threatening letters. Marcus explained that a key factor in any lawsuit would be proving that the HOA or its contractors acted under false pretenses. If they believed they had authority but did not, that alone could indicate a civil violation. However, criminal liability for the fire would require establishing intent or at least direct involvement. Marcus advised that the best course was a two-pronged approach. First, file a complaint challenging the HOA's claim over Arthur's property boundaries, and second, wait for the sheriff and fire marshal reports to determine if arson charges could be brought. Arthur's heart sank at the mention of a lengthy, possibly expensive legal battle. Yet, the alternative was to let the matter drop, leaving him with a destroyed barn and no accountability for those responsible. He told Marcus that he intended to see this through, even if it meant mortgaging what remained of his land. The attorney nodded, offering reassurance that he would do his best to keep costs manageable. As Arthur stepped out onto the sidewalk after the meeting, the sun glared down, intensifying the headache that had been brewing all morning. He felt no closer to justice or clarity. Each step forward brought him face to face with the reality that he was up against a well-organized group with financial resources and legal connections far greater than his own. He envisioned the pristine Oakstone Meadows sign again, recalling how each letter from the HOA had exuded an almost corporate confidence, as though they could not imagine being challenged. In the following week, an official from the fire marshal's office contacted him to confirm that the debris samples did indeed show traces of accelerant, some type of gasoline or kerosene-based mixture. There was no question that the fire had been intentionally started. The official mentioned that the local sheriff would likely upgrade the status of the investigation, possibly bringing in detectives with more specialized expertise. Arthur felt a surge of righteous anger. If the evidence could place someone from the HOA or a hired contractor at the scene that night, there would be no escaping accountability. During this tense interim, Arthur found unexpected solace in a friendly acquaintance, Andrea Gutierrez, a local real estate agent who had known him since childhood. They were not close, but they had attended the same middle school and occasionally bumped into each other at community events. Andrea reached out after hearing rumors of the fire and offered any assistance she could muster, explaining that she had experience with county maps, zoning issues, and the intricacies of suburban developments. Andrea visited the farm one late afternoon, navigating carefully around the rubble in stylish but surprisingly sturdy shoes. She spent time listening to Arthur recount the events and examined the property marker he had uncovered near the far edge of the fields. She believed it might be part of an older survey line that had never been updated in the digital county records, meaning the HOA might have either missed it or knowingly ignored it in their push for expansion. Though Arthur was cautious, he had seen how those connected to real estate developments often align themselves with the money behind new subdivisions. He sensed sincerity in Andrea's willingness to help. She volunteered to search through some lesser-known municipal archives, many of which were not digitized, in hopes of finding documentation that conclusively verified the farm's rightful boundaries. In the meantime, Arthur's frustration with the HOA escalated. Additional letters arrived, some referencing late dues that he supposedly owed for community amenities he had never used or agreed to pay for. Others threatened legal action if he did not immediately remove the scorched remains of the barn and livestock enclosures, claiming they violated Oakstone Meadows property standards. He also learned, through a neighbor who preferred to stay anonymous, that Isabel Carter was not the sole driving force behind the HOA. A second figure, Trevor Dixon, rumored to be a wealthy developer, had joined the board shortly after moving into Oakstone Meadows. Some whispered that he had a personal stake in acquiring Arthur's land, seeing it as prime space to expand the high-end community. Arthur wondered if the persistent harassment and the destructive fire might be part of a larger scheme orchestrated or encouraged by Dixon, aiming to render the property worthless so it could be purchased at a steal. Overwhelmed but determined, Arthur spent his mornings sifting through piles of rusted nails and twisted boards, slowly clearing a path through the largest debris piles. Whenever exhaustion threatened to stop him, he reminded himself that every piece of evidence he recovered, a damaged lock, a partially melted gas canister cap, anything suspicious, could be crucial in the official investigation. He carefully stored each item in plastic bins, labeled by the date and location where he had found it. When he needed a mental break from the physical labor, Arthur pored over legal resources he could find online, reading up on property rights, zoning conflicts, and precedent cases in which HOAs overstepped their bounds. The more he read, the more he recognized the complexity of his situation. Court battles could drag on, wearing down plaintiffs who had neither the time nor the money to fight. He refused to let that deter him. At times, the emotional weight was crushing. He would occasionally step away to the farthest corner of his property, where the fields gave way to a line of oaks, and stand there in the dappled sunlight, forcing himself to breathe. Memories of simpler days would flood in, the soft bleating of goats waiting for their morning feed, the crackle of gravel underfoot as he walked the perimeter, the comforting sense of belonging he had felt on this land since the first moment he planted seeds in the soil. Though the present was bleak, hope arrived in small doses. Andrea called to say she found references to an old farmland registry from when the county first established certain protected agricultural zones. She believed these documents could be a goldmine in proving that Arthur's land had been recognized as farmland outside municipal expansions, locked in by an older survey that the more recent suburban sprawl might have overlooked. She promised to bring copies by the following week. Meanwhile, Deputy Case returned to the farm, this time accompanied by a detective specializing in property crimes. They walked the grounds in silence, occasionally asking Arthur about specific details. Did he ever have altercations with any HOA members? Did he recall seeing any unfamiliar construction crews near the barn before he left to care for his father? Arthur recounted the small details he could remember, the repeated visits from individuals staking signs without permission, the letters referencing fines, and the uneasy feeling that he was being watched whenever he worked in the yard. The detective took meticulous notes, repeating that it would take time to analyze the camera footage and match it against any known vehicle logs, security camera networks, or eyewitness reports. A few nights later, Arthur found himself in his living room, staring at the subdued glow of the television. He had turned on a local news broadcast, hoping to catch a segment on a completely unrelated topic, just to distract his mind. Instead, he was surprised to see a brief story about an ongoing investigation into a suspicious fire on the outskirts of Oakstone Meadows. The clip was brief and lacked details, but the news anchor mentioned that law enforcement officials suspected foul play. Although the HOA was not directly named, the words, "dispute with a homeowners association," scrolled along the bottom of the screen. He turned the TV off, torn between relief that the story was getting attention and apprehension about how the HOA might react. Public scrutiny could either push them to distance themselves from the incident or cause them to double down, using every resource to discredit him. Despite the uncertainty, Arthur felt a small stirring of vindication. At least the matter was no longer confined to the shadows. In the days that followed, the tension in the neighborhood became palpable. One morning, Arthur spotted a cluster of Oakstone Meadows residents gathered near their entrance, whispering among themselves as he drove by. Some wore concerned expressions, while others looked resolute, as though they had already chosen sides in the dispute. He tried not to think too deeply about what they might be saying. Perhaps some, like him, recognized the injustice, or maybe they were simply worried that negative publicity would harm their property values. Shortly after, a notice arrived from the sheriff's department stating that law enforcement had officially labeled the barn fire as an act of arson. They requested Arthur's cooperation as the investigation moved forward, particularly regarding any additional details that might incriminate or exonerate certain parties. The letter concluded by advising him to remain cautious, hinting that those responsible might not appreciate scrutiny. That same afternoon, Marcus Dean called with a mix of news. On the civil side, he believed they had a strong case challenging the HOA's right to impose fees or fines, based on the property boundary documents. However, the issue of compensation for the destroyed barn, livestock, and any intangible losses, like the sentimental value of the farm, was more complex. Marcus was optimistic that if they could link the HOA's demands to the illegal destruction, the court might award a significant settlement. But first, they had to establish who actually lit the match, so to speak. Despite feeling a flicker of hope, Arthur also knew that even the best-case scenario would not bring back his animals. The barn that had stood for many years, built partly with lumber from a family homestead 2 generations prior, was gone forever. The best he could hope for was some measure of accountability and the resources to rebuild. Soon, rumors began circulating that certain members of the Oakstone Meadows board were distancing themselves from Isabel Carter and Trevor Dixon, who remained the main figureheads. There were whispers that some residents were appalled by the heavy-handed tactics used against Arthur. Destroying a home with animals crossed a line that suburban rules and fines alone could not justify. Arthur even received a brief, anonymous note in the mail, stating that not everyone in Oakstone Meadows agreed with what had happened, and that he had their quiet support. He had no idea who sent it, but it lifted his spirits to know that not everyone bought into the HOA's narrative. Andrea arrived shortly thereafter, brimming with excitement. She carried a thick manila folder stuffed with photocopies from the old farmland registry. The documents detailed how Arthur's acreage had been designated an agricultural preserve in the early 1970s. This meant that any subsequent developments would require either his explicit consent or a revision of county zoning laws, neither of which had occurred. Taken together with the modern county survey lines, it pointed to a strong argument. Oakstone Meadows, despite its expansion, held zero legal jurisdiction over Arthur's property. That evening, Arthur scanned every page into a digital archive, sending copies to Marcus Dean. As he finished, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. This was a tangible step forward. With the combined weight of historical agricultural designations, modern boundary lines, and the official findings of arson, the path to exposing the HOA's overreach seemed a little clearer. Still, he could not dismiss the possibility that, if cornered, the HOA board might lash out in new, unforeseen ways. One look at the scorched earth behind his house reminded him of just how far someone was willing to go. As the days passed, tension simmered all around him. He found new tire tracks on the edge of his property, and on one occasion, he thought he heard footsteps late at night near the perimeter. But each time he checked, he found no one. Word reached him through a mutual acquaintance that Isabel Carter had begun hosting more frequent board meetings, presumably to strategize the HOA's official response. No one could confirm who attended these gatherings, but it was widely assumed that Trevor Dixon played a significant role. In essence, lines were being drawn. On one side, Arthur, armed with legal documents, an arson investigation, and a handful of supportive locals. On the other, a well-funded HOA, unwilling to yield to embarrassment or potential liability. Yet there were signs of fracture within Oakstone Meadows itself. At least 2 board members reportedly resigned, citing disagreements with the leadership over unacceptable methods. Some residents, seeing smoke plumes that night and hearing rumors of arson, grew uneasy about their community's reputation. A local blog covering neighborhood news ran an editorial suggesting that the subdivision's quest for uniformity had gone too far. Amid this swirl of developments, Arthur found himself caught between exhaustion and resolve. He had to keep his focus on practical steps, documenting every threat and every piece of evidence, liaising with the investigator and the sheriff, and coordinating with Marcus Dean for upcoming court filings. Yet the emotional strain was immense. He missed the simple ritual of caring for his goats and gathering fresh eggs at dawn. The emptiness of the land weighed heavily, reminding him daily that his peaceful life had been shattered. Late one evening, he stood at the perimeter of his property, gazing across the open field at the glowing porch lights of the Oakstone Meadows homes in the distance. He tried to imagine the residents within, families preparing dinner, children doing homework, couples watching television. Did they know or care how drastically their so-called community standards had derailed a man's entire livelihood? A wave of bitterness rose in him before ebbing away, replaced by the conviction that he had to persevere. On a whim, he decided to check the corner where he had first noticed the boundary marker. The stake was still there, a piece of iron bearing faint etchings. Though dull and partially hidden among the grass, it represented an unyielding fact: the land was his, recognized by the county and historically protected for agricultural use. It served as a small but powerful reminder that truth was on his side, no matter how formidable the opposing forces seemed. He returned to the house under a canopy of stars. The route he walked was the same path he used to traverse with an armload of hay for his goats, or a basket of tomatoes on summer evenings. Now, each step was accompanied only by the crunch of charred debris underfoot. Despite the loss, Arthur held firm to the hope that the land could one day be restored, that new animals could roam the property, and that the orchard might be replanted. But that future depended on the outcome of a battle that felt both deeply personal and alarmingly public. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by dream fragments of flickering flames and half-seen silhouettes slinking away into the darkness. Yet, as the days moved forward, he pressed on. He would gather every ally he could find, neighbors, investigators, attorneys, even potential media outlets, to ensure that what had happened here would not be buried under bureaucratic excuses. And so, the stage was set for the next phase: formal legal challenges, official hearings, and a mounting wave of evidence that could either topple the leadership at Oakstone Meadows or leave Arthur struggling against a powerful entity determined to protect its interests. He steeled himself for the road ahead, resolved to stand as a guardian for the piece of land he called home, no matter how great the cost. Arthur awoke the next day with a fierce clarity of purpose. Outside his window, the blackened wreckage still loomed, an inescapable reminder that he had inherited a battleground rather than a simple homestead. Though his eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, he forced himself to begin cataloging the damage in the early light. He moved systematically, taking photographs on his phone of every scorched support beam, every blackened panel of metal roofing, and each piece of debris scattered across the once thriving garden. The goat's pen, now little more than charred posts and tangled wire, struck him with particular force. He lingered there, letting the moment settle in the unsettling silence, before taking the last few pictures and trudging toward the remains of the chicken coop. In the previous days, he had already contacted the local sheriff's department to request an investigation into what he believed to be arson. An official-sounding receptionist took his statement, calmly noting details despite his obvious frustration, and assured him that a deputy would arrive soon to examine the site. Knowing there was little more he could do until law enforcement showed up, Arthur continued to shift piles of ash and debris, uncovering fragments of old tools, bits of glass jars from his canning supplies, and rusted nails whose heads still reflected an occasional glint of morning light. Each discovery felt like reclaiming a piece of a life he feared might be slipping away. By midday, a weathered police cruiser pulled onto his property, the tires crunching over loose gravel and ash. A broad-shouldered deputy named William Case emerged, carrying a small notepad and wearing an expression of patient professionalism. Arthur offered a measured greeting and led him around the destruction, explaining the barn's original purpose and pointing out where the smaller coop had stood. The deputy examined the ground, occasionally pressing the toe of his boot into the soot, and asked how long Arthur had been away, how he discovered the fire upon returning, and whether anyone in the area might have had motive or opportunity. Arthur recounted the increasing hostility from the Oakstone Meadows HOA, culminating in letters, notices, and boundary disputes. The deputy nodded thoughtfully, scribbling in his notepad and remarking that civil disagreements often escalated to criminal acts when emotions ran high. Arthur provided the deputy with a flash drive containing footage from an old barn camera. Though the camera's resolution was poor, it showed silhouettes of unfamiliar figures near the barn on the night of the fire, followed by bright flares and sudden, dense smoke. The deputy accepted the flash drive and promised to pass it along to someone who could analyze it more thoroughly. He offered no immediate conclusions, only a standard assurance that the investigation would be thorough. Once the deputy was gone, Arthur stepped back inside his house, where the curtains were drawn against the glare of midday sun. The interior felt oddly calm, as if belonging to a different universe than the charred landscape outside. He found himself cleaning the kitchen counters and organizing random items in a half-hearted attempt to escape the feeling of helplessness. The acrid smell of burnt wood still wafted through the open windows, seeping in and serving as a relentless reminder of his predicament. Later that afternoon, a call came through from an unknown number. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Russell Kane, a local fire investigator. He explained that he would arrive the following morning to conduct a formal inspection, gather samples of debris, and speak with Arthur in more depth. Though the investigator sounded businesslike, Arthur clung to the hope that professional analysis of the wreckage would confirm what he already suspected. This was no accident, but an act of deliberate destruction. With dusk approaching, Arthur decided to drive around the nearby neighborhoods, hoping someone might have witnessed unusual vehicles or suspicious behavior on the night of the fire. He steered his aging pickup truck across the rural roads that wound toward Oakstone Meadows, slowing to observe the pristine entryway of the subdivision. Bright flower beds framed a sculpted stone wall bearing the community's name, and rows of modern homes with immaculate lawns stretched along winding streets. It felt worlds apart from the humble patch of farmland he had nurtured for years. He parked briefly near the sidewalks where a few residents walked small dogs or pushed strollers. Approaching them, he explained that he owned the farmland just beyond the subdivision and asked if they had seen anything strange or noteworthy before the fire. Most looked uneasy at his questions, either hurrying away or offering polite denials of any knowledge. One or two managed thin smiles, as if uncertain how to handle his desperation. Arthur realized the division between his way of life and the manicured world of Oakstone Meadows was as stark as ever. He returned home that evening, pulling into the drive just as the sun dipped below the tree line. Darkness lent the charred barn an even more haunting silhouette, and he felt a renewed surge of anger. The next morning, as promised, Russell Kane arrived in an unmarked SUV. He carried a metallic toolkit and wore clothes better suited to a lab than a farm. Over the next few hours, he meticulously photographed the scene, knelt down to collect small jars of ash, and noted the distinct burn patterns that suggested the presence of an accelerant. Arthur provided any information he could, describing the layout of the outbuildings, how the goats had lived in a corner of the barn, and the fact that he had been away caring for an ailing father when everything transpired. Russell's measured tone revealed little, yet he confirmed that the fire behaved in a way consistent with deliberate ignition rather than an electrical or natural cause. He promised to analyze the samples and coordinate with the sheriff's office about potential suspects. Though no immediate answers emerged, Arthur felt a glimmer of validation. The barn had not just spontaneously combusted, someone had intentionally set it ablaze. Later that day, Arthur met with Marcus Dean, a local attorney specializing in property disputes. Marcus, a lean, gray-haired man with a methodical approach, examined Arthur's trove of documents, county maps, letters from the HOA, and photographs of the ruined barn. As he flipped through the papers, Marcus occasionally raised an eyebrow or pursed his lips at the increasingly hostile tone in the HOA communications. After a careful review, he offered a two-pronged strategy. First, challenge the HOA's claim that they had any right to impose standards or fines on Arthur's farmland. Second, coordinate with law enforcement and the fire investigator to see if any HOA members, or contractors acting on their behalf, could be legally tied to the arson. Arthur was disheartened at the mention of a drawn-out legal fight, but he realized he had little choice. If he allowed the HOA's overreach to go unchecked, he might lose everything with no recourse. Marcus cautioned that establishing the HOA's criminal liability, or even the liability of individual members, would require incontrovertible evidence that they had ordered or committed the act. Civil liability, however, might be easier to prove if it emerged that they had employed a contractor to trespass and remove or destroy structures under the false impression that the farmland fell under their jurisdiction. After the meeting, Arthur felt no relief, only the burden of how complex this had become. He left the law office with a stack of legal forms to fill out and instructions to keep gathering evidence. When he returned home, he was met by yet another letter taped to his front door. Bearing the Oakstone Meadows logo, it alleged that the burned remains on his property were an eyesore and threatened further fines if he did not comply with community beautification regulations. The gall of it enraged him. They had, in all likelihood, orchestrated the damage, now they dared to penalize him for it. Filing the letter with the rest of his evidence, Arthur spent the next few days in a haze of physical labor, clearing away twisted beams, shattered boards, and scraps of sheet metal. He wore a cloth mask to protect his lungs from the ever-present ash swirling in the air. With each pile of debris he moved, he found small reminders of the life he once led, a scorched feeding trough, a half-burned wooden stool, even a fragment of a favorite cast-iron pan. Each item represented a memory, now fractured and incomplete. During these efforts, he received a visit from Andrea Gutierrez, a childhood acquaintance who had become a local real estate agent. She had heard rumors of the fire and came to offer assistance. Though Arthur was wary, knowing how real estate interests often intertwined with developments like Oakstone Meadows, Andrea assured him she was motivated by a desire to see justice done. She volunteered to help him comb through older municipal archives and farmland registries that might contain overlooked records proving the farmland was never part of the HOA's domain. Arthur led her to the corner of his property where he had discovered the original boundary stake. She examined it closely and took photographs with her phone. She believed that older, non-digitized records might confirm a farmland designation dating back decades, which, if never revoked, would mean the HOA had no legal authority to impose any of its regulations. Encouraged by her proactive approach, Arthur offered her copies of the property deeds and older survey maps he had managed to collect from the county clerk's office. In the days that followed, tension rippled through the neighborhood. Arthur noticed subtle changes. More passing cars slowed near his property, as if rubbernecking the site of the ruined barn. A few times, he heard footsteps after dark, though he never caught sight of whoever might be skulking around. He began to wonder if certain members of the HOA were monitoring his activities or if curious onlookers were simply drawn by the local controversy. Through a neighbor who wished to remain anonymous, Arthur learned that 2 members of the HOA board had recently resigned, citing moral objections to the way the dispute with Arthur was being handled. Isabel Carter, once seen jogging through the area and signing off every threatening letter, now seemed to be doubling down, hosting more frequent board meetings behind closed doors. A developer named Trevor Dixon, rumored to have significant financial interests in expanding Oakstone Meadows, had also joined the board. Many suspected he was pulling strings behind the scenes, viewing Arthur's farmland as prime real estate that could be folded into his next lucrative subdivision project. Amid the mounting unease, Deputy Case returned to the property with a detective specializing in property crimes. They asked more probing questions, trying to establish if there was any direct confrontation between Arthur and specific HOA members. They also inquired about possible contractors who might have been hired to remove or demolish structures. Arthur described the signposts that had been staked into his field, the repeated letters, and the eerie sensation of being watched whenever he worked in his garden. The detective listened attentively, noting each detail, and Arthur felt a small surge of relief that law enforcement seemed genuinely committed to finding the truth. Not long after, the local fire marshal's office contacted Arthur to confirm that debris samples contained a gasoline-based accelerant, eliminating any doubt that the blaze had been set intentionally. This official ruling shifted the sheriff's department investigation into higher gear. There was talk of possibly subpoenaing documents from Oakstone Meadows, especially if the HOA leadership had approved any emergency cleanup operation that might have spiraled out of control. Though the process was slow, Arthur sensed incremental progress. He also found respite in the occasional kindness of strangers. An older couple, who lived further down the rural road, stopped by with homemade casserole and words of sympathy. They offered a small donation to help cover the cost of feed should Arthur decide to acquire new animals someday. Another neighbor, whose property bordered Oakstone Meadows, left a note in Arthur's mailbox, stating that not everyone supported the HOA's bullying and that he would testify if he ever witnessed anything suspicious. These small gestures bolstered Arthur's spirit, reminding him that community was not defined solely by the loudest or most powerful voices. Andrea, true to her word, returned with a thick stack of photocopies she had dug up from an old farmland registry. The documents referenced an agricultural preserve status assigned decades prior, which had apparently been maintained through successive renewals that Arthur's grandfather had once signed. According to these records, none of the subsequent zoning modifications for suburban development could override the preserve designation without explicit consent from the landowner. Arthur began to see a coherent legal thread emerging. Oakstone Meadows had no rightful claim, and every attempt to impose its policies on him was an overreach at best and criminal trespass at worst. He spent long nights scanning these newly found documents, consolidating them with maps, survey images, and photographs of the boundary stake. Marcus Dean, upon receiving digital copies, responded with cautious optimism. It appeared they had a strong case to invalidate any and all fines or regulations from Oakstone Meadows. The arson charge was a separate matter, requiring direct evidence that someone associated with the HOA started the fire or knowingly allowed it to happen. Still, Marcus emphasized the importance of building a comprehensive narrative that showed a pattern: the HOA's persistent attempts to dominate Arthur's land, culminating in destruction. Local media began catching wind of the story. A short segment on the regional news channel described a suspicious fire at a farm embroiled in a boundary dispute. Though the coverage was sparse and lacked specifics, it mentioned the words "homeowners association" often enough to spark online chatter. Arthur monitored social media, where threads emerged speculating about malicious HOAs, developer greed, and the vulnerability of small landowners. Some users condemned the HOA outright, while others defended the concept of maintaining property values, oblivious to the fact that Arthur's farmland existed outside any legitimate homeowner jurisdiction. As the weeks wore on, the friction within Oakstone Meadows itself became more apparent. Several residents apparently confronted Isabel Carter and Trevor Dixon during a closed-door meeting, questioning whether the relentless pressure on Arthur was worth the risk of litigation and public relations fallout. Rumors spread that Carter had grown increasingly authoritarian, insisting that the best defense was a good offense. Others suspected that Dixon was still pushing for a covert deal to buy Arthur's land once it was deemed non-compliant, burned out, and therefore available at a diminished price. Meanwhile, Arthur's mental and physical stamina were tested daily. He continued sorting through rubble, laboring under the hot sun to salvage any pieces of wood or metal that might be reused in the future. Each night, his thoughts turned to the goats and chickens that had perished, and to the simple life he had once led, free from legal entanglements and the watchful eyes of those who disdained his rural habits. Sleep offered no true escape, as nightmares often replayed the bright orange flames devouring everything he loved. Amid these personal struggles, bits of hope surfaced. The sheriff's office sent a formal notice stating that arson was now the official classification for the fire, and that the department was seeking information from local contractors regarding any suspicious jobs authorized by the HOA. The letter's bureaucratic tone held the promise that justice might eventually be served. Marcus Dean also prepared preliminary filings against Oakstone Meadows, challenging not only the fines but also the association's unlicensed entry onto Arthur's property with the alleged goal of cleanup. If evidence could link that unauthorized entry to the subsequent fire, it could expose the HOA to both civil and criminal penalties. Arthur often found himself pacing the boundaries of his land in the evenings. The orchard he had planted years ago, once brimming with apple blossoms in spring, was mostly spared by the flames, but the trees no longer felt like a tranquil refuge. Instead, they stood as silent witnesses to the transformation of his life into a battleground of legal motions and investigative procedures. He reassured himself that he would rebuild, though the exact shape of that future remained murky. In quieter moments, he allowed himself to remember the farm's early days. Back then, he had patched together the barn with reclaimed lumber, piece by piece, forging a solid shelter for his animals. The gentle routine of early morning feedings and late evening closures had grounded him, providing a sense of purpose beyond anything he had found in more conventional jobs. That innocence, he now realized, had vanished the moment Oakstone Meadows began driving survey stakes into his fields. The farmland he treasured had become a target, valued for development potential rather than the wholesome life it sustained. One late afternoon, while he was loading debris into a trailer, he noticed a lone figure observing from the edge of the property. Fearing another unwelcome intrusion, he approached cautiously. It turned out to be a resident from Oakstone Meadows, a man older than Arthur, who tentatively introduced himself as someone not affiliated with the board. He seemed troubled, struggling to articulate his thoughts, eventually conveying that he did not agree with how the HOA had handled the situation. Though he did not stay long and offered no explicit testimony, his presence hinted that not everyone within those manicured streets supported the association's aggressive tactics. At night, Arthur would sit at his desk, reading over agricultural statutes and old newspaper clippings that Andrea had provided. Some articles detailed past expansions in Greenhaven County, referencing farmland that had resisted absorption into suburban sprawl through legal protections. He drew parallels between those stories and his own, seeing how battles over property lines often grew messy and personal, but could sometimes end in the vindication of the original landowner. The final blow that drove him to a new level of resolve arrived in the form of another letter from the HOA, this one more pointed and legalistic than the rest. It listed a fresh set of alleged infractions, including unapproved exterior structures and failure to maintain uniform aesthetic. The arrogance, combined with the knowledge that his farmland lay outside their rightful boundary, was infuriating. He scanned the letter, emailed it to Marcus, and filed the original alongside the other growing evidence of harassment. As the days crept on, investigators began knocking on doors around Oakstone Meadows. Some residents cooperated, others refused to speak. There were reports that a couple of contractors had indeed been hired to remove what the HOA labeled nuisance structures, though no one seemed willing to admit they had been tasked with a demolition or any sort of clearing that involved open flames. The swirl of finger-pointing created a rift in the community, with some neighbors blaming Isabel Carter, others implicating Trevor Dixon, and still others maintaining that Arthur's farmland was rightly subject to HOA governance, despite the evidence to the contrary. Arthur's frustration grew as he realized that legal processes moved at a snail's pace. Even the best intentions from the sheriff's department and the fire marshal could not force a quick resolution. Yet, he refused to let his sense of injustice wane. Each morning, he resolved to hold on to the truth, the farmland was his, historically recognized and protected, and someone had crossed a moral and legal line by reducing it to ashes. He clung to that certainty, anticipating that sooner or later, the tide would turn in his favor. One evening, Andrea arrived unannounced. She carried an even thicker set of documents tied with a rubber band, explaining that she had located additional reference maps and disclaimers attached to the original deed. Together, they spread the papers across his living room table, reading cryptic notations about zoning codes from decades earlier. Andrea pointed out certain paragraphs that clearly stated the land's exclusion from any future homeowner associations unless specific provisions were met, none of which had occurred. Arthur began to see a clearer path forward. Combining all the new evidence with the official findings of arson could provide a formidable legal argument. There was even a possibility of countersuing the HOA for damages that went beyond the cost of a barn or livestock. Marcus believed they could pursue compensation for emotional distress and the severe disruption of Arthur's livelihood. Though Arthur cared little for money compared to the desire for justice, he recognized that a large settlement might deter Oakstone Meadows from targeting others in the future. Reports trickled in from the sheriff's office that certain individuals on the HOA board were starting to cooperate more openly. Apparently, the mounting public pressure and the negative media attention had caused internal fractures. Some members now acknowledged that the farmland's boundary dispute had been mishandled from the start. Others, especially those aligned with Trevor Dixon, remained tight-lipped, possibly due to undisclosed financial interests in seeing the farm destroyed or sold. Arthur learned that the next step involved formal depositions, where attorneys could question HOA members under oath. The thought of facing them in a sterile conference room, with recording equipment capturing every word, both frightened and bolstered him. He pictured Isabel Carter, the face behind so many threatening letters, trying to explain why the association had ignored the farmland's actual zoning status. He imagined Trevor Dixon weaving some story about wanting to beautify the area for the sake of property values. If the truth emerged under legal scrutiny, it might finally bring about accountability. Throughout this tense waiting period, Arthur continued to toil on his property, now focusing on small restorations. He replaced damaged fence lines where he could, using spare tools donated by sympathetic neighbors. While he lacked the resources to rebuild the barn immediately, he cleared an area of debris, marking out a future spot for new construction. Each shovel of ash he removed felt like a symbolic step toward reclaiming what was rightfully his. He also found that routine tasks, weed management in the corners of the property that had escaped the fire, trimming back the wild brush near the orchard, helped calm his racing mind. The orchard itself remained a bittersweet refuge, its trees mercifully untouched by the flames. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning, he would walk among the rows of trees, recalling how this land used to feel, safe, self-contained, and nurturing. Despite everything, he vowed to revive that sense of harmony once the legal turmoil subsided. At odd intervals, he received additional updates from Marcus Dean. Some depositions were scheduled for the coming weeks, while others involved complicated negotiations over location and timing. The fire investigator, Russell Kane, had pieced together enough data to assert in an official report that multiple ignition points existed, a strong indicator of intentional arson. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department had begun circulating pictures of potential vehicles spotted on Arthur's camera feed. Though blurred, these images provided a timeline suggesting that someone arrived late at night, remained for approximately an hour, and then departed shortly before the blaze erupted. Arthur could not ignore the reality that proving the HOA or its members had directly orchestrated the fire might still be difficult. A contractor might claim they acted on unclear instructions. One of the HOA leaders might insist they had no idea a contractor would use fire to clear the barn. Even so, the civil case for unauthorized entry and destruction of private property looked increasingly solid, given the farmland's verifiable exclusion from the HOA map. A local journalist from a small-town newspaper reached out, requesting an interview. Arthur hesitated, wary of sensational headlines or misrepresentation. After some thought, he agreed to speak off the record, laying out the broad strokes of his story: the farmland passed down through his family, the barrage of letters from Oakstone Meadows, the suspicious boundary signs, and ultimately, the devastating fire. The journalist appeared sympathetic, asking careful questions about how the farmland factored into the county's older agricultural preservation statutes. Arthur hoped that controlled media coverage might shed further light on the injustice and galvanize more residents to speak up. As the sun set on yet another grueling day, he paused to survey his surroundings. The remains of the barn and coop were now mostly cleared, leaving empty dirt patches where animals once roamed. It looked barren, yet also like a fresh canvas. He reflected on how drastically the course of his life had changed in such a short time. He had gone from a quiet farmer, rarely concerned with legal matters, to someone who fielded calls from attorneys and investigators almost daily. The only constant was the land itself, silent yet steadfast, waiting for renewal. He reminded himself that no matter how tangled the proceedings became, he had truth on his side. The farmland was never part of the HOA, and the blaze was arson beyond any shadow of doubt. Time, patience, and a dogged refusal to yield to intimidation were his best tools. Though he still grappled with the profound grief of losing his animals and his cherished barn, he gathered what remained of his emotional reserves and prepared for the legal battles ahead. A faint breeze carried the scent of smoke lingering in the soil, but he sensed change in the air. More individuals within Oakstone Meadows seemed divided, uncertain whether to support Isabel Carter's relentless campaign or to distance themselves from what was now widely seen as a monumental overreach. Some even left messages on Arthur's voicemail, speaking in hushed, apologetic tones, though few dared to speak on the record. The tide was turning, if slowly, and he had to remain vigilant, ready to stand firm when the moment for truth arrived. Night settled across the property, the sky a deep navy scattered with pale stars. Arthur stood by the orchard's edge, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of wind in the trees. This land, gutted though it was, still held promise. He felt its quiet resonance, a reminder of why he fought so hard. Beneath the scorched ground, life had not been extinguished, seeds of renewal waited in the soil. All he needed was the rightful chance to protect what was his, to rebuild, and to ensure such a violation never happened again. In that reflective stillness, he steeled himself for the road ahead. Though the conflict with Oakstone Meadows had escalated beyond anything he imagined, he remained convinced that justice would prevail. With each piece of evidence and every supportive voice, the framework for holding the HOA accountable grew stronger. Deep down, he knew the path would not be quick or easy, but he also knew he would stand as a guardian for this land, a place he had always called home, no matter how formidable the opponents or how draining the journey became. The next several weeks brought a steady intensification of both the legal proceedings and the palpable tension simmering in the region surrounding the subdivision. Arthur found himself immersed in a tangle of paperwork, phone calls, and unexpected conversations, all set against the backdrop of his gutted farm and the silent orchard standing sentinel behind his house. At times, he could hardly believe how far his quiet life had unraveled. The farmhouse, though structurally unscathed, felt altered by the weight of what had happened. Each day, its walls bore witness to new revelations and incessant worry, while he tried to hold on to the hope that the truth would ultimately prevail. As depositions loomed, Arthur felt a mounting pressure. Marcus Dean, his attorney, explained that a deposition was a formal interview conducted under oath, recorded by a court reporter, where each side could question witnesses connected to the case. In this situation, the depositions would concern the property boundaries, the HOA's authority, or lack thereof, and any involvement of its members in the fire that had razed Arthur's barn. Marcus was cautious yet resolute. He believed the farmland's historical documents and the clear line of older zoning rules would prove Arthur's stance beyond doubt. Any remaining question revolved around linking the HOA, or individuals acting at its behest, to the arson itself. When the scheduled day arrived, Arthur drove to a modest office building on the outskirts of Greenhaven County. The morning light painted the parking lot in a hazy gold, but Arthur felt little of the day's warmth. His stomach twisted with apprehension. He tried to remind himself that his presence here was not only about personal vindication but also about defending the principle that private land, especially farmland with historical protection, could not be swallowed up by a homeowners association and a developer's ambition. Inside the building, the interior decor was clinical, neutral-toned walls, functional chairs, and a reception desk behind which a clerk shuffled paperwork. Marcus waited for Arthur near a hallway lined with closed doors. He offered a brief, encouraging nod and mentioned that the opposing counsel had arrived about 15 minutes prior, accompanied by what appeared to be a small entourage of advisors or additional legal staff. Arthur braced himself, imagining what sort of personalities he might face in that room. Even though he had not seen Isabel Carter in person since the earliest days of her jogs near the farmland, he felt certain she would be involved, or at least her influence would hover over the proceedings. The deposition took place in a narrow conference room with a long wooden table. A court reporter sat at one end, preparing transcription equipment, while attorneys for both sides took their seats. Among them were two individuals introduced as counsel representing Oakstone Meadows HOA. Both wore sharp suits, projecting confidence through clipped, precise speech. Marcus introduced himself and Arthur, and they all settled into an atmosphere charged with unspoken tension. The first questions revolved around the farmland's history. Marcus took the lead by presenting documents verifying the property's long-standing agricultural designation. Arthur found himself reciting details he had come to memorize over the past weeks: the date of the farmland registry's creation, the subsequent renewals, his grandfather's signature on older deeds, and the county's records that clearly demarcated the land well beyond the HOA's boundary. The opposing attorneys maintained blank expressions, occasionally interjecting with minor challenges. Were these records ever updated? Could the farmland status have quietly changed when the subdivision was surveyed? Marcus firmly rebutted each suggestion, citing not only the official documents but also the original boundary stake that Arthur had rediscovered. A shift came when the discussion turned to the HOA's notices and threat letters. Copies of each letter, with the association's header, were handed around. Marcus asked Arthur to confirm which ones he had received and to describe the sequence: the initial cordial-sounding letter, the ramped-up fines, and the eventual threat of forced compliance. The opposing counsel attempted to argue that these letters merely represented standard enforcement for anyone within or near the HOA's region. Marcus countered by referencing the farmland's explicit exclusion and pointing to the association's own membership rules, which indicated that only homeowners who had signed relevant covenants were subject to HOA oversight. Arthur, for his part, strove to keep his voice level, though anger flickered whenever he recalled reading those demands in real time, demands that turned out to be groundless. Toward midday, the conversation touched on the subject of the arson. The court reporter paused to switch out recording devices, and the attorneys shuffled their notes. Then, the inquiry took on a sharper tone. Marcus asked Arthur to recount the day he returned from helping his father, the exact state of the farm upon arrival, and the details gleaned from the barn camera's partial footage. Arthur explained how, in the recording, silhouettes could be seen hovering near the building and how the flames appeared suddenly across multiple spots. The opposing counsel repeatedly objected, pointing out that silhouettes could be anyone, that the footage was unclear, and that it did not prove a direct link to the HOA. Yet the formality of their objections could not erase the fact that arson had been officially confirmed by the fire marshal's office. After hours of questioning, everyone took a short break. Arthur retreated to a hallway bench, running a hand across his face. Marcus offered him a bottle of water and a quiet remark that, so far, they had presented a coherent case showing the HOA's lack of authority. The challenge, of course, remained in connecting that overreach to the fire. Nevertheless, any objective observer could see that the association had pressured Arthur relentlessly, even though the farmland lay outside its grasp. Once the break ended, a new witness took the seat at the table, a representative from the county clerk's office, there to confirm the official property boundary lines. He displayed copies of survey maps, each set marked by different eras of the county's development. The lines, he stated under oath, never placed Arthur's farmland within the Oakstone Meadows domain. The local attorney for the HOA tried posing hypothetical situations in which zoning lines might have changed, but the clerk's representative stood firm, explaining that any revision of official boundaries required extensive paperwork and public hearings. None of those procedures had ever taken place with respect to Arthur's land. The look on the opposing counsel's faces grew rigid, and Arthur sensed the first tangible sign that the legal fortress of the HOA was cracking. At the end of the day's deposition, Arthur exited the building and walked across the parking lot, the sky stained with a dusky orange hue. Marcus assured him that the session had gone well, especially with the direct testimony of the clerk's representative. Still, it was just the beginning. Additional depositions involving certain HOA board members and possibly contractors associated with the so-called cleanup crew were set for the following week. Arthur realized this was only a single step in a grueling process. Exhausted, he started the engine of his old pickup truck and drove home, mind spinning with everything yet to come. That night, as he paced through the darkened living room, Arthur noticed the reflection of the orchard in the window's glass. In the quiet gloom, the silhouette of the apple trees reminded him that the land was more than just a contested space, it was a living entity, carrying memories of every season he had spent nurturing it. The orchard had endured storms, droughts, and now a catastrophic fire mere yards away. Somehow, it remained standing, even as legal battles threatened everything around it. Arthur found a small measure of comfort in its steadfastness. A few days later, he received an unexpected visitor. Standing on the dirt driveway was a woman he recognized from the edges of the Oakstone Meadows development, Penelope Waters, someone whose face he had seen briefly at a local store but never really spoken to. She introduced herself hesitantly, explaining that she had watched the situation unfold from a distance and felt compelled to speak. Arthur listened with caution, uncertain whether she was friend or foe, but her demeanor suggested unease with the HOA's tactics. Penelope confided that she had attended several HOA meetings where Isabel Carter and Trevor Dixon pushed agendas regarding beautification and unification of the area. Carter had consistently framed Arthur's farm as a blight, an unregulated zone that supposedly threatened property values. Penelope admitted that most members present were unaware the farmland actually lay outside HOA authority. The board meetings evidently glossed over that complication, presenting the matter as if Arthur had simply refused to comply with standard community guidelines. Penelope offered to write a statement detailing the half-truths and omissions she had witnessed. Arthur sensed the sincerity in her voice, though he advised her to speak with his attorney directly, ensuring everything was handled properly. Before leaving, she apologized for not coming forward sooner, explaining that she feared retaliation from the more dominant figures in the association. Arthur thanked her, feeling both gratitude and sorrow that residents felt so intimidated. The next round of depositions arrived quickly. This time, the focus centered on the activities of the HOA board. Isabel Carter was not present, but a middle-aged man named Stephen Brandt stepped forward as the board's appointed spokesman. He wore a guarded expression, frequently consulting with the HOA's attorneys before answering even the simplest questions. Under Marcus's methodical questioning, Stephen confirmed that the association had issued multiple notices to Arthur, citing alleged bylaw infractions. He also acknowledged that the board had contracted a waste removal service to address nuisance structures, though he insisted everything was done under the assumption that Arthur's property fell within HOA territory. When pressed on whether any discussion included the possibility of burning structures, Stephen hesitated. He stated that any form of open-flame demolition would have been illegal under local ordinances and had never been part of their official plan. Marcus inquired why the board believed they held any right to remove buildings from Arthur's land in the first place, leading Stephen to mention Trevor Dixon's repeated assurances that the farmland had been quietly annexed into Oakstone Meadows. The mention of Trevor's name caused a ripple of attention in the conference room. The transcripts would clearly capture that Stephen, an HOA board member, was pointing to Dixon as the source of misinformation. Following these revelations, Arthur and Marcus shared a significant look. It supported their suspicion that the push to incorporate Arthur's land stemmed from a developer's personal interest. If Trevor Dixon had strong financial motives, that might explain the ferocity with which the HOA pursued enforcement actions. The attorneys for Oakstone Meadows, sensing the precarious turn, frequently objected to questions linking Dixon to the alleged arson, stating there was no proof he had orchestrated anything so extreme. Marcus countered that they would see what the forensic evidence, along with sworn testimony, would ultimately reveal. Outside the formal setting of depositions, Arthur noticed a remarkable shift in the community's atmosphere. Local news outlets began running more detailed coverage after hearing that depositions were underway. Journalists requested interviews with those who felt emboldened to speak, including Andrea Gutierrez, who had provided crucial documents, and Penelope Waters, who had gathered the courage to share her account of the HOA meetings. A slow swell of public opinion seemed to form around the belief that Arthur's land had been aggressively targeted. Andrea, for her part, continued her research, uncovering obscure municipal records that referenced how farmland in Greenhaven County could only be rezoned through a transparent, multi-step process involving public notice and hearings. She highlighted how none of those steps had occurred for Arthur's property. In a phone conversation with Arthur, she marveled at how easily official-sounding letters could sway people into believing authority existed where it did not. The more she learned, the clearer it became that intimidation, rather than legal right, had driven the HOA's actions. Days later, Trevor Dixon's turn for deposition arrived. Arthur did not attend this session in person, his presence was not required, and Marcus recommended that he conserve energy for the main hearings, but he waited anxiously for Marcus's summary afterward. When Marcus finally called, his voice carried the weariness of a man who had just spent hours in grueling legal combat. He explained that Dixon refused to concede any wrongdoing, maintaining that he acted only on best information available regarding property boundaries. He also claimed to have zero knowledge of any plan involving fire. Instead, suggesting that contractors must have either made a catastrophic mistake or acted without authorization. Yet Marcus sensed cracks in Dixon's polished facade. The more pointed the questioning became, particularly around potential motives for wanting the land cleared, the more Dixon resorted to evasions and repeated disclaimers that he was only one of several board members. Even so, the transcript recorded that Dixon had personally corresponded with contractors. Marcus believed a careful review of those communications, once subpoenaed, might reveal inconsistencies in Dixon's story. In the meantime, the criminal investigation progressed fitfully. Deputy Case and the detective assigned to property crimes attempted to trace the specific contractors who might have worked around Arthur's land. A few smaller outfits had been hired on a short-term basis, apparently to remove debris and unwanted structures, but most maintained they had only done hauling work and left the property well before any hint of fire. One contractor admitted noticing a pungent smell of gasoline the afternoon he arrived, which he assumed was from farm equipment. Another had tried to call the HOA liaison when he realized the barn seemed occupied by animals, and was told the animals were being handled by their owner. None claimed direct knowledge of the flames that eventually consumed the place. The detective reported that conflicting stories abounded, but no one outright confessed to setting the fire. Arthur felt a wave of frustration each time he heard how carefully every suspect distanced themselves from responsibility. Throughout these developments, Arthur continued to piece his life back together in small, tangible ways. He managed to clean a large portion of the scorched field, bagging up ash and debris for disposal. He prepared a corner of the property for possible new fencing, although the cost of rebuilding a barn from scratch weighed heavily on his mind. The orchard, thriving in the summer heat, offered him at least a semblance of normalcy. Some of the apple trees even began fruiting earlier than usual, their branches dotted with green that promised a future harvest. It felt like a silent pledge from the land itself that renewal was possible. Encouragingly, Arthur started receiving discreet messages of support from within Oakstone Meadows. A few residents left anonymous notes in his mailbox, expressing regret for how the situation had escalated. One offered to contribute financially if Arthur needed help rebuilding some portion of the barn. Another letter, unsigned but written in careful cursive, explained that while many within the HOA did not oppose farmland or small-scale agriculture, they had been led to believe Arthur was simply a defiant neighbor flouting community rules. Now that the real boundary lines and the farmland's protected status were coming to light, more people questioned the board's previous claims. Still, pockets of hostility remained. One afternoon, while Arthur was stacking salvaged wood, he noticed a sleek car parked briefly at the roadside. A man inside snapped a few photos of the property through the window before speeding away. Another time, a small group of residents from Oakstone Meadows drove by, staring openly, some with disapproval, some with curiosity. The tension echoed a larger cultural divide between those who prized the uniformity of a polished subdivision and those who valued the older, rural character that Arthur's land represented. Late one night, as he tried to find sleep, Arthur's thoughts drifted over the slow progression of the investigations and depositions. He worried that the legal labyrinth might stretch on indefinitely, draining his financial resources and energy. Yet every conversation with Marcus reinforced that they were building a robust case. The farmland's established exclusion from HOA boundaries was near incontestable at this point, and even among the association's members, a split was forming. Some resigned their positions, others cooperated with investigators. The next phase, Marcus hinted, might involve a settlement offer, though he cautioned Arthur not to compromise on the key issues: the acknowledgement of wrongdoing and proper compensation for the damage inflicted. Weeks turned into more than a month of incremental progress. The fire marshal's office released a final, official report that detailed the presence of multiple ignition points. It clearly declared the blaze an act of arson, citing evidence of an accelerant spread in a pattern inconsistent with any accidental cause. The language was technical but unequivocal, lending weight to Arthur's accusation that someone deliberately burned the barn. The challenge remained in linking that criminal act to the HOA or an associated party under direct orders. In the midst of all this, Andrea brought new findings, correspondence from over a year prior, showing that Trevor Dixon had inquired with the county about future expansion possibilities. In these emails, Dixon hinted at acquiring adjacent farmland to create additional lots. Although the farmland in question was unnamed, the location references seemed to point directly to Arthur's property. Andrea's eyes shone with excitement when she showed him these printouts, explaining that they could be critical in proving Dixon's motive, especially if no official sale had been pursued and yet the HOA still behaved as though the farmland was theirs to direct. Marcus planned to introduce this evidence at the earliest opportunity, possibly in a motion to show a pattern of intent. By now, even some local politicians had begun to take notice. A county council member reached out to Arthur, expressing concern that the situation tarnished the area's reputation and might undermine confidence in future development agreements. She hinted that behind closed doors, certain officials resented the HOA's brazen tactics and were prepared to back legislative measures that clarified farmland protections, just so no such incident could repeat. Arthur felt an odd mixture of pride and weariness, knowing his struggles might spur positive change while also wishing none of this had ever happened. Meanwhile, the orchard quietly continued its cycle, offering a gentle, unspoken reminder that life moved forward despite legal tangles and heartbreak. Arthur found solace in the routine of checking the trees, watering them when rainfall was sparse, and occasionally plucking the earliest apples, still somewhat small and tart, yet full of promise. Whenever frustration at the lengthy legal fight overwhelmed him, he would stand among those trees and remember why he refused to give up. The farmland was not just a piece of ground, it was a living record of his history and the heritage of simpler times, a place he had once shared with his beloved animals. Finally, a pivotal moment arrived. A special civil hearing was scheduled to address Arthur's request for an injunction against the HOA. If granted, the injunction would forbid Oakstone Meadows from any further attempts to claim authority, impose fines, or hire contractors to enter Arthur's property. The hearing would be public, meaning local media could attend, potentially shining a harsher spotlight on the association's actions. Marcus believed this was a crucial opportunity to solidify the official stance that Arthur's farmland lay outside HOA control. On the morning of the hearing, Arthur entered the courthouse with shaky nerves. He found the assigned courtroom and sat beside Marcus at a polished wooden table. A few rows of seating behind them were scattered with observers, some from the press, others presumably curious county residents. Across the aisle, the HOA's legal team conferred with two men in suits and a woman who looked vaguely familiar from earlier depositions. Isabel Carter was conspicuously absent, and so was Trevor Dixon. That fact alone raised eyebrows. Perhaps their legal advisors had decided it would be best to keep them out of the public eye. The presiding judge, a stern-faced woman with reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, opened the hearing. Marcus stood to present a concise summary of Arthur's case, an undisputed farmland boundary stretching back decades, the barrage of spurious HOA notices, fines, and threats, and the culminating tragedy of an arson that destroyed Arthur's barn and livestock. He introduced the documents that Andrea and Arthur had collected, surveys, letters, farmland registries, building the argument that the HOA's claims were baseless. Marcus did not directly accuse the association of orchestrating the fire, but he strongly implied a correlation between the persistent harassment and the eventual destruction. The HOA's counsel attempted to muddy the waters by citing broad language from certain county ordinances about transitional areas near developments. However, Marcus displayed the farmland's official designations and hammered home the point: no valid transition or annexation process had ever been started, let alone completed. He also pointed to the final line of the clerk's representative's sworn statement, which unequivocally placed Arthur's land outside Oakstone Meadows' domain. Observing from his seat, Arthur felt his anxiety blend with a flicker of triumph. He silently thanked Andrea, Penelope, and others who had come forward with information. This was the moment they had all worked toward, exposing the association's false narrative. The judge asked a few pointed questions to both sides, evidently trying to parse whether there was any legitimate basis for the HOA's conduct. The HOA's attorneys repeated that everything was done under good faith misunderstandings, yet they struggled to explain why these misunderstandings persisted so consistently, even after official records indicated otherwise. Near the hearing's conclusion, the judge expressed clear skepticism toward the HOA's position, remarking that their repeated notices and attempts to regulate Arthur's property appeared to have continued well past any point of plausible confusion. She stated that, pending the final result of the lawsuit, she saw compelling reason to grant Arthur's request for an injunction. This would stop the HOA from any enforcement action or harassment that implied they had authority over the farmland. At that, a faint murmur spread through the small crowd in attendance. Arthur felt a surge of relief as the judge announced her intent, pending formal written confirmation, to impose a restraining measure preventing the HOA from stepping foot on his land without explicit permission. Marcus leaned over, whispering that this was a strong indication the court believed Arthur's claims had merit. Though not an outright victory in the full legal sense, since the overarching civil and possible criminal cases remained unresolved, it was a monumental step toward securing Arthur's right to live free from the HOA's interference. After the hearing, Arthur stepped outside, squinting in the bright midday sun. The small throng of local reporters loitered near the courthouse doors, eager for comments. He hesitated, then decided it was time to speak plainly, if only to underscore the significance of what had just transpired. Cameras rolled as he summarized the farmland's rightful exclusion from the subdivision and expressed gratitude that the court had recognized the need for protective measures. He made no incendiary accusations but insisted that those responsible for the fire must be held accountable. His voice trembled with emotion, recalling the animals he had lost and the livelihood upended. In the days following the hearing, local headlines spoke of a landmark injunction granted to protect a small farm from overreaching HOA oversight. Online forums buzzed with debates over whether homeowner associations wield too much power or whether certain developments cross ethical lines for financial gain. Arthur watched from a distance, aware that public opinion could shift quickly, but hopeful that the immediate wave of sympathy would endure long enough to drive real accountability. He continued to cooperate with the ongoing police and fire marshal inquiries. Although no arrests had been made, Deputy Case suggested that the circle of potential suspects was narrowing. A few quietly retired contractors might yet come forward with more information, especially if they felt legally compelled. Marcus indicated that, in parallel, the civil process would grind forward. There would be further hearings, negotiations, or possibly a trial if the HOA refused to settle. Even as the legal horizon stretched uncertainly before him, Arthur felt a renewed sense of purpose. He worked each day on a modest blueprint for rebuilding a scaled-down barn, nothing extravagant, just enough to house a new flock of chickens or a couple of goats once he felt comfortable returning to that life. The orchard, awash in the gentle warmth of approaching autumn, offered a steady visual of the land's innate resilience. He began gathering a small harvest of apples, storing them in crates near the farmhouse, occasionally gifting some to supportive neighbors who had reached out with kindness. He also took steps to reevaluate his insurance coverage, seeking new policies that might better protect outbuildings and livestock against disasters, whether natural or man-made. The costs were daunting, but he reasoned that if the farmland remained his sanctuary for the future, he should safeguard it as thoroughly as possible. Each phone call to an insurance agent reminded him of how drastically his perspective had shifted since the day he first discovered that ominous letter from Oakstone Meadows under his windshield wiper. Alongside these practical matters, Arthur found himself fielding emotional burdens. Many nights, he would awaken from dreams in which he heard the frantic bleating of goats amid encroaching flames. Sometimes, while clearing debris or tending to the orchard, he found himself unconsciously listening for the familiar cluck of hens that no longer roamed the yard. Grief clung to him, a testament to the losses that even legal victories could never fully remedy. Yet hope began to flicker in unexpected places. The orchard's harvest was bountiful enough that Andrea suggested he donate some apples to a local farmer's market. At first, he dismissed the idea. His orchard was not meant for commercial production, and he felt too emotionally drained to socialize. But Andrea persisted, explaining that a presence at the market might remind the community of the farm's rightful role in the county's agricultural tapestry. Reluctantly, Arthur agreed, loading up 2 crates of apples and driving to the weekend market that had grown in popularity ever since the area's expansions. The experience surprised him in a positive way. Shoppers drifting past recognized him from local news segments. Some offered words of solidarity. Others simply asked about the orchard, curious how he maintained fruit trees amid the turmoil. A few kids pointed at the apples with excitement, and one older woman commended him for standing his ground, telling him that her late husband had also fought a boundary dispute many years ago. Though the day was tinged with the shadow of everything he had lost, Arthur discovered small comfort in the goodwill extended by strangers. As he loaded the unsold apples back into his truck, he felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for weeks. No matter how loud the HOA's demands or how forceful the developer's ambitions, there was still a corner of this county that cherished small farms and the produce they offered. The farmland was more than just a legal battleground, it was part of a collective identity that many valued, even if they lived behind manicured lawns or within tidy streets. Shortly thereafter, Marcus informed him that the HOA's council had made overtures about a potential settlement, but the terms were vague and unsatisfactory, something along the lines of ceasing all fines in exchange for no further legal claims by Arthur. Marcus refused on Arthur's behalf, asserting that they would not waive claims for damages or withdraw from the arson investigation without meaningful accountability. The conversation stalled, but it revealed that the association was feeling the heat from public scrutiny, legal challenges, and a community that no longer accepted their narrative blindly. A few days later, a phone call from Deputy Case carried a surprising development. Certain materials retrieved from contractors' correspondence hinted at last-minute changes in the scope of their work orders. Deputy Case explained that messages between a contractor and an unnamed board member referenced the phrase, "any means necessary to remove that eyesore," though it did not explicitly mention a planned fire. The phrase was ominous enough to warrant further questioning. Arthur listened, heart pounding, as Deputy Case laid out the possibility that this might finally connect the HOA's push to a more direct role in the barn's destruction. The investigation remained ongoing, but the detective believed they were closer than ever to unraveling which individuals had knowingly stepped outside legal boundaries. Through all this, Arthur's daily life became an odd blend of cautious optimism and relentless vigilance. Every time a new piece of evidence came to light, he felt another fraction of the burden lift, replaced by the determination to see justice served. At the same time, he guarded himself against the potential for more underhanded tactics. While the injunction protected him from overt intrusion, he knew that sabotage could take subtler forms, especially if certain powerful figures were growing desperate. Nonetheless, the orchard's leaves began shifting to shades of amber and orange, signaling the approach of autumn. The days shortened, the nights carried a slight chill, and the battered soil of Arthur's cleared field slowly sprouted with new grass, thanks to the final bursts of summer rain. Now and then, he would stand near the orchard's edge at sunset, gazing over the gently sloping land. In those quiet moments, he allowed himself to dream about what rebuilding might look like: a modest barn, new goats and chickens, and a sense of serenity restored. The fire had stolen a chapter of his life, but it had not destroyed the deeper essence of the place. He shared these thoughts with Andrea when she visited one afternoon to drop off more archival documents, though by now they scarcely needed more. The boundaries were well established, no one could refute them. Andrea, for her part, marveled at Arthur's resolve. She admitted she had expected him to either buckle under the legal onslaught or grow consumed by bitterness. Yet, in between bouts of anger or exhaustion, he showed glimmers of resilience. When she remarked on how quickly the orchard recovered compared to the barn site, Arthur nodded and said he took solace in nature's capacity to restore itself. Slowly, the next legal milestone drew near, a date for the main civil hearing that would address liability, damages, and the potential for punitive measures. Marcus believed the hearing might spur the HOA to negotiate seriously, especially if they feared a decisive court ruling could leave them exposed to staggering legal costs and public humiliation. Arthur, though prepared to see the trial through, found himself torn between wanting closure and longing for the definitive answers that might only come with a full hearing of evidence, including the possibility of revealing just who lit the match that destroyed his barn. In parallel, the criminal investigation edged forward at its own pace. The detective mentioned that new interviews were being conducted with individuals who had previously refused to talk. Rumors surfaced that at least one contractor had sought a deal with prosecutors in exchange for cooperating, which suggested that behind the scenes, law enforcement might be close to building a case strong enough for charges. Arthur tried not to get his hopes too high, but the prospect of actual accountability for the arson flickered in his thoughts with every passing day. Amid these swirling uncertainties, he persisted in his small acts of renewal. The orchard harvest became a mild success at the local farmers' market, and he tentatively set aside a corner of his savings for eventual livestock. His routine, wake early, clear any remaining debris, sort through legal documents, was punctuated by calls with Marcus, visits from investigators, and an occasional trip into town for errands. Though some days passed in a blur, he felt a certain purpose in every action. Autumn gradually settled across the county, bringing a crispness to the air and a mosaic of changing leaves. The orchard trees turned brilliant shades of red and gold, a vibrant testament to the natural cycles that continued despite all human conflict. Arthur often found solace walking among them at twilight, reflecting on how far he had come from the moment he first saw his land in flames. Though the trauma still cut deep, he recognized that the very soil beneath his feet retained an enduring spirit of its own. The stage was set for a confrontation that carried implications not just for him but for the broader community. Underneath the mundane rhythms of depositions, injunctions, and orchard harvests lay the possibility of a new precedent, one that might protect other small landowners from facing a similar onslaught of intimidation. Arthur sensed that if he succeeded, future farmland would be safer from those who believed money and influence could bulldoze over the rights of individuals. If he failed, the message would be equally strong, that such aggressions could be profitable, or at least unobstructed, in the face of insufficient legal checks. He chose to believe in a better outcome. Each morning, rising before dawn, he would step outside to feel the cold dew on the grass, inhaling the scent of earth. In that stillness, he reminded himself that the orchard and the farmland were more than property lines on a map. They were living, breathing corners of the world that offered sustenance, memory, and the quiet dignity of honest work. No threat, no development plan, and no misguided authority could ever fully erase that truth. He carried it with him, day by day, into the uncertain future, prepared to stand firm until at last, the smoke cleared and a new chapter could begin.